The most dangerous mistake a powerful man can make is humiliating someone smarter than him in public. The crystal chandeliers above the Manhattan ballroom glowed like frozen stars, scattering gold light across champagne glasses worth more than most people's monthly rent. Laughter drifted through the room in soft waves. Expensive watches flashed beneath tailored sleeves. Investors, CEOs, and politicians moved through the charity gala with the relaxed confidence of people who had never worried about overdraft fees or overdue bills. And moving silently between them all was Claire Whitmore. Black uniform, silver tray balanced effortlessly in one hand. Calm blue-gray eyes that never stayed in one place too long. To the guests, she was invisible. Just another waitress serving sparkling water and $1,000 wine to people who barely looked at her face. But Claire noticed everything. The nervous tapping of fingers around whiskey glasses. The whispered arguments near the balcony. The giant financial projection glowing behind the stage where billionaires debated markets like kings discussing weather patterns. She heard numbers, percentages, oil futures, interest rates. Every detail quietly filed away inside a mind no one in that room would ever expect from a waitress. Table 12 needs another bottle, the manager whispered as he rushed past her. Claire nodded once and moved toward the VIP section. Her steps were smooth and measured against the marble floor. She could feel the weight of the room before she even reached his table. Nathaniel Reed, founder of Reed Capital, billionaire, 41 years old, ruthless in business, famous for destroying competitors on live television with the same calm expression other men used while ordering coffee. Tonight, he sat beneath the chandelier light in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Claire's car. Steel gray eyes, perfect posture, the kind of presence that made conversations lower when he entered a room. Around him sat hedge fund managers and tech executives laughing a little too hard at every joke he made. Claire approached quietly. "Another bourbon, Mr. Reed?" she asked. Nathaniel barely looked up from the financial graph glowing on the massive screen behind him. "Neat," he replied flatly. Then his eyes shifted toward the tablet tucked beneath Claire's tray. His expression changed slightly. "What's that?" Claire glanced down. A research article. Economic forecasting models. She had been reading during her 10-minute break beside the kitchen hallway. "Just something to read between tables," she answered softly. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. One corner of his mouth lifted. "Not warm. Not kind. Dangerous." "That's so," he said loudly enough for the entire table to hear. "Tell me something, sweetheart. Does pretending to understand economics make carrying drinks more interesting?" A few people laughed immediately. One woman lowered her champagne glass to hide her smile. Claire stayed still, completely still. Nathaniel finally looked directly at her now, amused by the silence. "Come on," he continued. "You're reading market analytics at a billionaire investment gala. Either that's confidence or delusion." More laughter rolled across the table. Claire slowly placed the bourbon in front of him without spilling a single drop. Her voice remained calm. "Sometimes the difference between confidence and delusion," she said quietly, "is whether the room is smart enough to notice." The laughter stopped. Instantly, Nathaniel's smile faded just slightly as Claire turned and walked away beneath the chandelier light, leaving behind a silence that suddenly felt much heavier than before. The silence around Nathaniel Reed's table lingered long after Claire disappeared into the crowd of tuxedos and glittering dresses. No one laughed anymore. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances before quietly returning to their drinks. Nathaniel lifted his bourbon slowly, but his attention stayed fixed on the far side of the ballroom, where Claire moved between tables with the same calm expression she had worn moments earlier. As if nothing had happened. As if she had not just embarrassed one of the most powerful men in Manhattan without raising her voice above a whisper. "Interesting waitress," one investor muttered carefully. Nathaniel did not answer. His jaw tightened slightly as he watched. Claire stopped beside another table, refill a champagne glass, and continue walking with smooth precision. No attitude. No smug smile. That bothered him more than if she had openly challenged him. People usually reacted to Nathaniel Reed in one of three ways: fear, admiration, or greed. Claire Whitmore had shown none of them. "You know her?" another guest asked. "No," Nathaniel replied flatly. But something in his tone suggested that answer irritated him. Across the ballroom, Claire stepped into the service hallway behind the kitchen. The noise of the gala softened instantly once the heavy doors closed behind her. No crystal chandeliers. No piano music. Just fluorescent lights humming softly above stainless steel counters. She exhaled slowly and set the empty tray down beside the coffee station. "What exactly did you say to read capital?" one of the servers whispered as she rushed past carrying wine glasses. Claire gave a faint smile. Nothing important. But it was important. Everyone knew it. Nathaniel Reed had built an empire humiliating people smarter than him before they could threaten his control. Yet somehow a waitress had unsettled him in less than 30 seconds. Claire reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the folded research article she had been reading earlier. Complex mathematical formulas covered the pages in tight black print. Forecasting instability models. Economic collapse patterns. Notes written carefully in blue ink along the margins. Her handwriting was elegant, precise, nothing like the rushed scribbles of someone casually pretending to understand the material. "Claire." The manager's voice cut sharply through the hallway. She looked up. "Mr. Reed requested full bottle service in the investor lounge upstairs," he said nervously. "Personally." Claire paused for 1 second too long. Upstairs was private access, reserved only for elite investors and billion-dollar clients. Employees rarely entered unless specifically requested. "Understood," she answered quietly. The manager hesitated. "And Claire," he lowered his voice. "Try not to upset him again." Claire almost smiled at that. Not arrogant, just tired. "I was not the one trying to embarrass someone tonight," she replied softly. 10 minutes later, the private investor lounge overlooked Manhattan through 40-foot glass windows streaked with rain. The city glowed below like gold scattered across black velvet. Nathaniel stood alone near the window, one hand in his pocket, the other holding his crystal glass untouched. Claire entered silently with the bourbon bottle balanced against her palm. Nathaniel did not turn around immediately. "Do you enjoy making powerful people uncomfortable?" he asked finally. Claire poured the bourbon carefully. "Only the ones who mistake humiliation for intelligence." Nathaniel turned then. Slow. Controlled. His steel-gray eyes locked onto hers beneath the soft amber light. For the first time that night, he was no longer smiling at all. Rain slid slowly down the massive glass windows behind Nathaniel Reed, turning the Manhattan skyline into blurred rivers of gold and silver light. The investor lounge was quiet now. Too quiet. Somewhere below them, soft piano music still drifted up from the ballroom, but up here the air felt heavier. Sharper. Claire placed the bourbon bottle back onto the polished black counter and stepped away carefully. Nathaniel watched her every movement with growing fascination. Not attraction. Not yet. Something more dangerous. Curiosity. "You speak like someone who has spent time around people with real power," he said slowly. Claire adjusted the silver cuff of her uniform sleeve. "Power is not difficult to recognize," she replied. "Most powerful people make certain everyone in the room feels it." Nathaniel gave a dry smile. "And you disapprove?" Claire looked toward the city lights instead of at him. "I think people who truly understand their value rarely need to announce it." The words landed softly, but Nathaniel felt them anyway. He had spent 20 years building Reed Capital into one of the most feared investment firms in America. Financial magazines called him brilliant. Competitors called him ruthless. Employees called him terrifying when he was not around to hear it. Yet somehow this woman carrying bourbon and champagne spoke to him with less fear than billion-dollar executives. Nathaniel loosened his tie slightly and stepped closer to the glowing financial screen mounted beside the windows. Charts and market projections still covered the display from earlier presentations. Red trend lines. Declining futures. Forecast percentages. "You implied my model was wrong downstairs," he said without turning around. "That is a serious accusation." Claire remained calm. "Not an accusation. An observation." Nathaniel looked over his shoulder. "Then explain it." Claire hesitated. Just briefly. Most people would have seen opportunity standing in front of them. A billionaire asking for their opinion. Access to influence. Connections. Money. But Claire's expression only showed exhaustion beneath the soft amber lighting. "Why?" she asked quietly. Nathaniel frowned slightly. "Because I want to know whether your confidence is real." Claire almost smiled at that. "And if it is?" Nathaniel walked toward her now, slow and deliberate. "Then I want to know why someone with your intelligence is carrying drink trays instead of running a company." For the first time that evening, something flickered behind Claire's eyes. Not fear. Pain. Small. Controlled. Gone almost instantly. She turned toward the financial screen instead. Your volatility assumptions are delayed by 2 quarters, she said calmly. You treated temporary energy inflation like a short-cycle disruption instead of a structural shift. Nathaniel's expression hardened slightly. That model came from analysts at Princeton and Stanford. Then they should know better, Claire replied softly. Nathaniel stared at her. The confidence in her voice was unsettling because it lacked ego completely. She was not trying to impress him. She genuinely believed she was correct. Claire stepped closer to the screen and picked up the digital stylus resting nearby. Numbers reflected softly across her pale skin beneath the blue market projections. Your collapse began here, she said, circling a section of the graph. You ignored international shipping contractions because your team assumed domestic recovery would stabilize consumer demand. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. That data was classified until last month. Claire stopped moving. The room suddenly felt very still again. Slowly, she placed the stylus back onto the table. Then your analysts are even more overpaid than I thought. Nathaniel should have been offended. Instead, something unexpected happened. He laughed, quietly at first, then genuinely. The sound surprised both of them. Claire blinked once as Nathaniel shook his head slightly, still smiling faintly now. Who exactly are you, Claire Whitmore? He asked. Claire looked at him for a long moment while rain continued sliding across the windows behind them. Then she answered with the same calm voice that had unsettled him all night. Someone who learned a long time ago that intelligence sounds very different when it comes from a woman in a waitress uniform. For several seconds, Nathaniel Reed said nothing at all. The rain continued tapping softly against the 40-foot windows while the city pulsed below them in rivers of gold light. Claire's words still hung in the air between them. Calm, precise, dangerous in the way truth often was. Nathaniel studied her carefully now, no longer seeing just the black uniform or silver tray resting beside the counter. The details felt wrong suddenly. The elegant way she spoke, the absolute control in her posture, even the way she analyzed financial models without hesitation. None of it matched the role she was pretending to live inside. You talk like someone who spent years inside boardrooms, Nathaniel said quietly. Claire folded her hands in front of her. And you talk like someone who believes boardrooms are the center of the universe. Nathaniel almost smiled again. Almost. You enjoy challenging people. No, Claire replied softly. I enjoy watching arrogant people realize they are not the smartest person in the room. That one landed harder. Nathaniel walked toward the bar counter and poured another inch of bourbon into his glass. The amber liquid reflected against his expensive watch beneath the dim light. Normally, conversations bored him after 5 minutes unless money was involved. But this woman kept forcing him to think instead of dominate. It was unfamiliar and strangely addictive. You still have not answered my question, he said. Why are you here? Claire looked down briefly at the polished marble floor. For the first time all evening, her confidence seemed to dim around the edges. Not weakness, weariness. Life changes faster than people expect, she answered carefully. Nathaniel leaned against the counter. That sounds like avoidance. Claire gave a faint smile without humor. That is because it is. Downstairs, applause suddenly erupted from the ballroom as another speaker finished presenting on stage. The muffled sound echoed faintly through the ceiling above them. Claire glanced toward the staircase instinctively. Work pulling her back toward reality. Nathaniel noticed it immediately. Relax, he said. No one will fire you for being up here. Claire met his eyes again. You say that because you are used to controlling outcomes. Nathaniel frowned slightly. Do not psychoanalyze me, Claire. I am not, she replied calmly. I am observing. Silence again. Nathaniel took a slow sip of bourbon. Fine, he said at last. Observe this. He walked back toward the massive financial screen glowing against the wall and pulled up another projection. International market trends appeared instantly across the display. If you are so certain my analysts are wrong, he said, tell me what happens next quarter. Claire stared at the screen. Numbers reflected softly in her eyes. She did not answer immediately. Nathaniel noticed that too. Most people rushed to impress him. Claire thought first, carefully, like someone who understood the cost of being wrong. Finally, she stepped closer to the screen. Your technology sector will stabilize temporarily, she said. But commercial real estate exposure is going to hurt your investors by winter. Nathaniel's expression hardened slightly. Impossible. Claire pointed calmly toward a hidden section of the chart. Not impossible. Delayed. Your clients are still reacting emotionally to post-pandemic recovery trends instead of actual occupancy data. Nathaniel stared at the numbers, then back at her. Slowly, the confidence in his face began shifting into something else. Something quieter. Because she was right again. Claire stepped back. From the screen. People with money become dangerous when they mistake optimism for evidence, she said softly. Nathaniel looked at her for a very long time after that. Then finally, almost reluctantly, he asked the question that had been growing heavier in his mind all night. What happened to you? Claire's eyes flickered slightly. Just once. Outside the windows, lightning flashed silently above Manhattan. And for the first time since entering the investor lounge, Claire Whitmore looked like someone carrying a story she had spent years trying not to tell. Claire Whitmore hated that question more than almost anything. Not because she could not answer it. Because she could. Too easily. What happened to you? The words sounded harmless inside Nathaniel Reed's quiet investor lounge while rain streaked the windows behind them. But Claire had learned that people only asked questions like that after they noticed someone had fallen. No one ever asked it while you were still standing on stage collecting awards beneath bright lights. Nathaniel watched her carefully now, waiting, studying every small reaction with the same focus he probably used during billion-dollar negotiations. Claire looked away first. You assumed something happened, she said softly. Nathaniel swirled the bourbon in his glass. A woman with your mind does not accidentally end up serving cocktails at charity galas. Claire folded her arms loosely. And a billionaire does not accidentally become emotionally dependent on controlling every room he walks into. Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly at that. Claire noticed. Of course she did. She noticed everything. Outside, thunder rolled faintly above the skyline, while the investor lounge remained wrapped in amber light and quiet tension. Nathaniel set his glass down onto the marble counter with controlled precision. You enjoy turning people into psychological case studies. No, Claire replied calmly. I just spent years watching powerful men underestimate me. Patterns become easy to recognize after a while. Nathaniel stepped closer. Not threatening. Curious. And what pattern do you see in me? Claire hesitated. She should have ended the conversation. Already. Returned downstairs. Finished her shift. Gone home to her tiny apartment filled with unpaid medical bills, secondhand books, and research papers no one knew she still wrote at 3 o'clock in the morning. But something about Nathaniel unsettled her in ways she did not entirely understand. Beneath the arrogance, there was exhaustion in him too. Deep, buried carefully under expensive suits and calculated confidence. You built your reputation on never being the least intelligent person in the room, Claire said quietly. That is why tonight bothered you. Nathaniel did not deny it, which surprised her. Most wealthy men protected their ego like a national security asset. But Nathaniel only looked toward the rain-covered skyline and asked softly, was I wrong? Claire frowned slightly. About what? About you. The question hung between them. Heavy, unexpectedly sincere. Claire looked down at the silver tray resting beside the bourbon bottle. Her reflection stared faintly back from the polished metal. People are usually wrong about me, she admitted quietly. Nathaniel's expression softened just slightly. Then tell me the truth. Claire closed her eyes for one brief second. And suddenly she was somewhere else entirely. A university auditorium in Boston. Applause echoing around her while professors shook her hand after a lecture on predictive economic instability. Her father smiling proudly in the front row. Her mother healthy, laughing. Everything still intact before hospitals and debt and grief turned brilliance into survival. Claire opened her eyes again quickly. The memory vanished. The truth, she said softly, is that life does not care how intelligent you are. Nathaniel stayed silent. Claire continued before she could stop herself. One phone call can erase years of plans. Her voice remained controlled, but quieter now. More human. One hospital bill can turn academic awards into overdue rent notices. Nathaniel watched her carefully as realization slowly settled into his expression. You left your career for family, he said. Claire gave the faintest nod. My father died during my second doctoral year. The room felt even quieter after that. And my mother got sick 6 months later. Nathaniel looked at her differently now. Not with pity. Claire would have hated that. But with something unfamiliar in his eyes. Respect. Real respect. Claire noticed it immediately. And somehow, that felt far more dangerous. Respect changed the atmosphere between them more than anger ever could. Claire Whitmore realized that almost immediately. Nathaniel Reed no longer looked at her like entertainment. He looked at her like a problem he could not solve. And for a man like Nathaniel, that was rare enough to become dangerous. The investor lounge remained wrapped in low amber light, while rain continued sliding across the glass walls overlooking Manhattan. Downstairs, the gala carried on beneath chandeliers and polite laughter, completely unaware that one conversation upstairs had already shifted something neither of them fully understood yet. Nathaniel loosened his tie another inch and studied Claire carefully. "You gave all of it up?" he asked quietly. Claire leaned lightly against the edge of the marble counter. "There was not much choice." Nathaniel frowned. "There is always a choice." Claire gave him a long look after that. Not hostile, just honest. That is something wealthy people say when they have never had to choose between ambition and survival. The words hit harder than Nathaniel expected. He looked away first this time. Outside the windows, headlights moved through the rain far below like slow rivers of white and gold. Claire continued softly. "When my mother got sick, insurance stopped covering most of her treatments after 8 months." Her voice remained calm, but Nathaniel noticed the careful control beneath it now. The kind people developed after repeating painful truths too many times. "My father left behind debt from his own medical care before he died. I was 26 years old and halfway through my doctorate." Nathaniel stayed silent. Claire folded her arms loosely. "Hospitals do not care about academic potential. Landlords do not accept research papers instead of rent." Nathaniel swallowed slowly. Something unfamiliar pressed against his chest. Guilt. Not performative guilt. Real guilt. Because, for years he had stood on stages telling young entrepreneurs that success belonged to people who worked hardest. Discipline. Vision. Sacrifice. He had built entire speeches around merit and determination. But standing here now, listening to Claire quietly describe how brilliance collapsed under hospital bills, those speeches suddenly sounded painfully incomplete. "So you started working here," he said. Claire nodded once. 3 jobs at first." Nathaniel stared at her. 3. Day shifts at a bookstore. Nights here. Freelance statistical modeling online after midnight. Nathaniel exhaled slowly through his nose. "That is insane." Claire almost smiled. "No, that is America." The honesty in her voice stunned him more than the words themselves. She was not bitter. That was what unsettled him most. No self-pity. No dramatic anger toward the world. Just quiet acceptance from someone who had already learned life was not fair long before most people noticed. Nathaniel walked toward the financial screen again, but this time his movements felt slower, less controlled. "And through all of that," he asked carefully, "you still kept researching economic models?" Claire looked down briefly. "At night." Nathaniel turned toward her fully now. "Why?" Claire hesitated. The question seemed to catch her off guard more than any other. She looked toward the rain-covered skyline before answering. "Because it reminded me who I used to be." Silence settled heavily between them again. Nathaniel felt something shift inside him hearing that sentence. Not admiration exactly. Something deeper. Recognition. Because despite the billion-dollar empire and magazine covers and endless interviews, there were nights when Nathaniel barely recognized himself anymore either. Claire moved toward the silver tray beside the counter. "I should go back downstairs," she said softly. Nathaniel stepped forward before thinking. "Claire." She stopped. He rarely hesitated in conversations. Yet now the words came slower than usual. "I owe you an apology." Claire looked surprised for the first time all evening. Nathaniel met her eyes steadily. "What I said earlier downstairs," he exhaled once. "I was trying to impress a room full of people by humiliating someone I assumed could not fight back." Claire said nothing. Nathaniel lowered his voice slightly. "And I was wrong about you." Claire studied him carefully beneath the warm amber light. Then finally, very softly, she answered, "No, Mr. Reed. You were wrong about what intelligence looks like." Claire Whitmore stood motionless for a moment after Nathaniel Reed apologized. Not because she was shocked powerful men could say sorry, because most of them never meant it. But something in Nathaniel's voice sounded different now. Quieter. Stripped of performance. The investor lounge around them had become almost surreal beneath the low amber lighting and rain-covered glass walls. Far below, Manhattan pulsed endlessly through the storm, while laughter and music drifted faintly upward from the gala downstairs. Two completely different worlds separated by one staircase. Claire picked up the silver tray slowly. Most people do not apologize after they embarrass someone publicly, she said. Nathaniel slipped one hand into his pocket. Most people do not get called out publicly by a waitress with a better understanding of global economics than their executive board. Claire almost smiled at that. Almost. Nathaniel noticed the tiny shift immediately. It was the first real expression he had seen from her all evening that was not guarded behind professionalism or restraint. There it is, he said quietly. Claire frowned slightly. What? Proof that you are capable of smiling. Claire shook her head softly and turned toward the staircase. Do not get used to it. Nathaniel watched her walk a few steps before speaking again. Claire. She stopped without turning around. If things had gone differently, he asked carefully, what would you be doing right now? Claire stared toward the staircase in silence for several seconds. The question sounded simple, but it carried years inside it. Conferences she never attended. Research papers left unfinished. A future she once believed was guaranteed before grief quietly rewrote everything. Teaching, she answered finally. Researching economic instability and behavioral finance. Nathaniel nodded slowly. You would have been exceptional at it. Claire looked back over her shoulder then, studying him carefully as if trying to decide whether he was mocking her. But Nathaniel's expression remained completely sincere. That unsettled her more than arrogance ever could. You barely know me, she said softly. Nathaniel gave a faint smile. I know enough. Before Claire could answer, the investor lounge doors suddenly opened behind them. A tall man in an expensive navy suit stepped inside, holding a tablet against his chest. Nathaniel, the board members are asking where you are before the Asia call starts. The man stopped mid-sentence the moment he noticed Claire standing there in her waitress uniform beside the financial display. His eyes moved from her to the market projections on the screen, then to Nathaniel's untouched bourbon glass. Confusion crossed his face instantly. Sorry, he said carefully. I did not realize you were busy. Nathaniel's expression cooled immediately into the controlled billionaire persona Claire had seen downstairs earlier. What is it, Daniel? Daniel stepped farther into the room. Tokyo is concerned about the commercial property exposure report. He hesitated again, glancing briefly toward Claire. They want revised projections before opening bell. Nathaniel looked toward the giant financial screen. Then, unexpectedly, his eyes shifted toward Claire instead. Interesting timing, he murmured softly. Claire immediately understood what he was thinking. No, she said calmly. Nathaniel raised one eyebrow. You do not even know what I was going to ask. Yes, I do. Claire crossed her arms lightly. And the answer is still no. Daniel looked completely lost now. Nathaniel ignored him. One conversation, he said. That is all. Claire shook her head. I am a waitress, remember? Nathaniel stepped closer. No, he said quietly. That is just the uniform people see. The words hit harder than Claire expected. She looked away briefly toward the rain-covered skyline. Dangerous. This entire conversation felt dangerous now. Not because Nathaniel Reed intimidated her. Because for the first time in years, someone was looking at her. Like the version of herself she had almost forgotten still existed. Nathaniel lowered his voice slightly. Help me understand what my board is missing. Claire tightened her grip on the tray for one small moment. Then slowly, against every instinct telling her not to step back into that world again, she turned toward the glowing financial screen. Daniel stood near the investor lounge door in complete silence while Claire Whitmore stepped toward the glowing financial screen. The atmosphere in the room had changed again. Not tense anymore. Focused. Nathaniel Reed watched her carefully as she placed the silver tray onto the marble counter beside the untouched bourbon glass. Outside the windows, rain rolled across Manhattan in silver streaks, while lightning flickered somewhere above the skyline. Claire folded one arm lightly across her waist as she studied the market projections covering the screen. Numbers reflected in her blue-gray eyes beneath the soft amber light. Nathaniel noticed how quickly her expression shifted once she focused on data. The exhaustion disappeared. So did the guarded waitress persona she carried downstairs among the gala guests. What remained was sharpness, precision, a mind waking back up inside familiar territory. Your Tokyo board is reacting emotionally, Claire said quietly after several seconds. Daniel frowned. Emotionally? Claire nodded once without looking away from the screen. They are overcorrecting because they are afraid of another global slowdown. Nathaniel crossed his arms. And they are wrong. Claire reached for the digital stylus again. Partially. She circled several areas on the projection. Commercial real estate is weak, yes. But your bigger risk is behavioral panic spreading through secondary investors after the first quarter reports. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Nathaniel. That is exactly what Tokyo said 2 hours ago, he admitted carefully. Claire barely reacted. Then they identified the symptom. She pointed toward another trend line. Not the cause. Nathaniel stepped closer beside her now. Close enough to see tiny handwritten equations appearing in the margins of the screen as Claire adjusted the forecast assumptions manually. Fast, elegant, confident. The instability starts here, she explained softly. Middle-income consumer confidence has been artificially inflated by temporary wage adjustments. Once that corrects, spending drops faster than your analysts predicted. Daniel stared openly now. How are you doing this in your head? Claire gave a faint shrug. Years of pattern analysis. Nathaniel noticed something then. For the first time all night, Claire looked completely alive. Not surviving. Not hiding. Alive. The woman standing beside the screen looked nothing like the exhausted waitress quietly carrying champagne through the ballroom downstairs. She looked like someone who belonged in front of lecture halls and economic summits. Someone who once expected her voice to matter. Run the revised projection, Nathaniel said quietly. Daniel immediately moved toward the conference tablet and entered Claire's numbers. A few seconds later, the screen refreshed. Silence filled the room instantly. Nathaniel stared at the updated forecast. So did Daniel. The loss margins stabilized dramatically. Not perfect, but survivable. Daniel looked up slowly. This reduces projected exposure by almost 40%. Claire stepped back from the screen. Because your previous model assumed rational investor behavior during instability. Nathaniel looked toward her. And investors are not rational. Claire almost smiled again. No one with money ever is. Daniel let out a quiet breath of disbelief. Nathaniel. He shook his head slowly while staring at Claire. Who is she? The question hung in the air. Claire's posture stiffened slightly the moment she heard it. Nathaniel noticed immediately. He could almost see the walls returning behind her eyes again. The instinct to disappear before people started asking too many questions. Before admiration became expectation. Before intelligence turned into pressure all over again. Nathaniel looked at Daniel calmly. Someone smarter than everyone in this building. Claire lowered her eyes briefly after hearing that. Not because she enjoyed compliments. Because she had spent years trying to forget how much those words once meant. To her, Daniel still looked stunned. She should be sitting on our economic advisory board. Claire shook her head immediately. No, Nathaniel frowned slightly. Why not? Claire picked up the silver tray again. The waitress returning piece by piece around her shoulders like armor. Because boardrooms do not scare me, she said softly. But becoming that person again does. Nathaniel watched her carefully after that. And for the first time in years, the billionaire who controlled billion-dollar negotiations realized there was something more fragile than power. Hope. The investor lounge fell quiet again after Claire Whitmore picked up the silver tray. Not awkward quietness. The kind that settles over a room after something true has been spoken aloud. Nathaniel Reed watched her carefully while the rain continued sliding down the towering glass walls behind them. He could still see the glowing financial projections reflected faintly in her eyes. Even now, standing once again in a waitress uniform, Claire looked more capable than most executives he had spent years paying millions of dollars to advise him. Daniel slowly closed the tablet in his hands. The Tokyo team is going to ask who corrected the model, he said cautiously. Claire immediately shook her head. No, Nathaniel frowned slightly. Why does that matter? Claire looked toward the city below them instead of answering right away. Thousands of lights shimmered through the rain across Manhattan. Offices. Apartments. Lives unfolding behind windows no one else would ever notice. Because the second people discover what you can do, she said quietly, they stop seeing you as human. Nathaniel felt that sentence more than he expected. Claire continued softly. You become useful, valuable, impressive. Her fingers tightened slightly around the silver tray, but very rarely understood. Daniel looked uncomfortable suddenly, as though he had accidentally stepped into a conversation much deeper than quarterly projections and market exposure. Nathaniel stayed silent for several seconds. Then finally he asked, "Is that why you disappeared?" Claire gave a faint, tired smile. "I did not disappear." Her eyes lowered, briefly toward the black uniform she wore. "People just stopped looking closely once I became ordinary." The words lingered heavily between them. Nathaniel thought back to the beginning of the evening. The joke, the public humiliation, the laughter around the ballroom table. He had looked directly at Claire Whitmore and still failed to see her. And somehow that realization embarrassed him more now than being corrected in front of investors ever had. Downstairs, the gala music shifted into a slower piano melody, drifting softly through the ceiling. Claire glanced toward the staircase again. "I really should get back to work." Nathaniel stepped closer before she could leave completely. "Claire." She looked at him calmly. Nathaniel hesitated. Strange. He negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking. Yet speaking honestly to one exhausted waitress suddenly felt harder than any boardroom confrontation he had ever survived. "You were right earlier," he admitted quietly. "About me." Claire tilted her head slightly. Nathaniel exhaled once. "I built my life believing intelligence always looked polished. Expensive. Confident." His eyes lowered briefly toward the tray in her hands. "Tonight reminded me how blind that idea really is." Claire studied him carefully beneath the warm amber light. No arrogance remained in his expression now, just honesty, quiet and unfamiliar. Nathaniel gave a small shake of his head. "You know the worst part?" Claire waited silently. "The smartest person I met all year was carrying my bourbon." For the first time that night, Claire laughed softly. Real laughter. Brief. Warm. Completely unguarded. The sound caught Nathaniel off guard more than anything else had. Then Claire adjusted the tray against her arm and stepped toward the staircase. Halfway to the door, she paused. "Mr. Reed." Nathaniel looked up immediately. Claire's expression softened just slightly. "Do not confuse titles with intelligence anymore." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I will try not to." Claire gave one final glance toward the glowing financial screen behind him before disappearing down the staircase toward the ballroom below. Nathaniel remained standing beside the rain-covered windows long after she left. The city lights shimmered across the glass while the untouched bourbon sat quietly beside the revised forecast that would probably save his company millions. But Nathaniel barely looked at either of them, because somewhere between the market projections and the silence, a billionaire had just realized something that no amount of money had ever taught him before. The quietest person in the room is not always the weakest one. Sometimes, they are simply the only person secure enough not to announce their worth.